So what do you think of when I say the term slavery? You know, do you picture the shackles and that shuffling of feet that we think of with the American South, right? Where all these slaves were bought elsewhere, brought over to the U.S. and to America. And a lot died. A lot were abused, mistreated, you name it. You know, on those ships where they were carried over, a lot of them died. And they suffered, and they were abused and thrown overboard. Any of these things that we can think of. And the question is, and one thing that's been asked a lot of the Bible and of God is, does he allow slavery? And does he condone it? Because we look at the Old Testament, we see that they had servants. There were slaves. But what does that mean? And what's the context of that where we read that, and does it compare to the things that we think about in modern day of what slavery looks like? And the answer to that question is that it wasn't the same. We have to look at it and be honest as far as that they did have slaves, but it was regulated. And just because God regulates something doesn't mean that he condones it. And if we read Leviticus 25:42-44, "For they are my servants whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves. You shall not rule over him ruthlessly, but fear your God. As for your male and female slaves whom you may have, you may buy male and female slaves from among the nations that are around you. You may also buy from among the strangers who sojourn with you and their clans that are with you, who have been born in your land, and they may be your property." And so we have to look at that honestly. Does God condone slavery in the sense that we think about it? So the fact is that the Israelites were allowed to have slaves. They were allowed to have servants. And as we'll talk about in the lesson, there's two different kinds that the Old Testament talks about. There's essentially indentured servitude, where Hebrews who were in debt, who were essentially bankrupt, had a way to pay that back by giving themselves over as a servant to a Hebrew master, to that employer, if you will. And then you had this other passage that talks about those from the surrounding nations. And it makes that distinction between the Hebrew servants and slaves, if you want to term it that, and then these other people that were bought, or whatever the case, and they were the slaves to Hebrews. And that's what we want to talk about. Because Scripture as a whole, it has come under attack as far as that it permits something akin to what American slavery looked like. And obviously the root question of that is God even good if he allows that? But when we take it in context, and when we read verses like in Exodus, it says, "When men quarrel and one strikes the other with a stone, or with his fist, and the man does not die but takes to his bed, then if the man rises again and walks outdoors with his staff, he who struck him shall be clear. Only he shall pay for the loss of his time and shall have him thoroughly healed." And then verse 20, it follows, "When a man strikes his slave, male or female, with a rod, and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be avenged. But if the slave survives a day or two, he is not to be avenged, for the slave is his money." And so we see here there's a difference between a slave and another Israelite, right? In the previous verses it says, hey, if two men get in a quarrel and one strikes the other but he survives, he's okay, but he does have to compensate for that man's loss of time as far as the money he would have made if he was fine. And when we look at the slaves, what it's saying is that if a master and a slave get into a dispute and they get in an argument and it gets physical, they're treating the slave in the very same way that they treat a fellow Hebrew. Because there's no punishment to be met as long as that person is okay. And there's nothing to be avenged in the sense that that servant, that slave, is the one already making that person money. And so he doesn't have to get compensated from anybody because there's nobody to be compensated from. And that's what it means that when it says he shouldn't be avenged. So when we look in all of Scripture, in Deuteronomy 23, it talks about that if a slave runs away and they're trying to get away from their master, whether it's abuse, whether it's any of these things, it's against the law to force that slave back to their master. And we look at the surrounding nations, we look at all these other nations that were around Israel at the time and throughout even all of history, and very few had the protections that the Old Testament affords slaves and Hebrew servants alike. And the midst of all that, the key point is this: the goal of Christ, the goal of God is not social reform, it's to save people. And in saving people, in redeeming their identity and bringing us back to peace and joy and seeing others like we're made in God's image, whether somebody's saved or not, when we see that, it causes us to want to have social reform. It causes us to want to have equality. We look at people that fought slavery in recent memory, William Wilberforce and all these other people who were Christians, who were devout Christians. And the reason they did it was because they saw that everybody was made in God's image. And so we look at the Old Testament when it comes to slavery. Yes, there was slavery, but Israel was progressive. And God has his own timing for things. He didn't command them to just abolish everything and have this perfect society because he knows that that's impossible with human beings. And so what God has always done in a broken world, in this broken framework that we live in, that was once perfect before the garden, but is now broken, what God does is he works within that broken framework. And while God himself might want something that's better than what he's condoning as far as regulating slavery, he's still going to have mercy on us, knowing that we're corrupt, knowing that we are going to do things that wrong other people. And so he works within a broken framework to do what he can do at the time. Because in his own timing, things will change. They changed when Christ came, and they keep changing now after Christ came. God is alive and he is working. And just because he doesn't do everything we think should be done in one moment, doesn't mean he's not working it throughout history. And that's the point that is made in all these discussions about morality and is slavery okay and did God condone it? He didn't condone it, but he regulated it for that reason. Because it's a broken world and he works within a broken framework. And we read in Scripture until those end times come, until God redeems the world and everybody in it, all those who have believed in him, that's going to remain broken. And it's up to us as Christians to have that social reform. Once we know Christ, once we see that, once we see the value of every being and every person. And God tries again to work within that, so he protects them in the Old Testament, more so than any other culture around. Even in the Code of Hammurabi and the Babylonians, if a slave escaped his master and somebody else found that slave, he had to return that slave or he could be punished by death. And that's the truth of it. It was progressive for the time. And God's goal is to save. It's not social reform, but social reform comes out of that salvation, out of that joy, out of that peace, out of that value that we see in ourselves and other people because of what Christ did. And that's why it has slavery in Israel. And that's why there's still slavery in the New Testament. But it is always talked against. Paul says in the New Testament, if you can get freedom, get it. But ultimately, you are to respect those around you. You are to respect your master. Why? To be a witness. Because it is all about Christ. And from that flows everything else. There were protections, and it is not the same thing as the chains and all the abuse and the torture that we see throughout history and the history of the slave trade, especially in America and the Old South. So we have to keep that in mind when we think about these things. And we'll get into it and learn more about it today.